Happy Arvo. Hello. How are you? I have great news, guys. Today, I'm not talking about Kohl's. I'm done talking about Kohl's for at least 24 hours. Today, I'm watching this video, UK versus Australian architecture. Now, why am I choosing UK versus Australian? Well, she didn't make a USA versus Australian, but regardless, I guess now I just get to compare both. Because I'm the American here. Obviously, I'm mostly here for the Australian architecture. It's by Dreaming of Down Under. I like that name. That's a fun name, isn't it? For an Australian channel. Dreaming of Down Under. Go check her out. Link down below. I'm always interested to hear about, like, the typical Australian home. Like, just what's the vibe? What's it like?
Hi, I'm Lisa from Australian travel and migration blog dreamingofdownunder.com. Today I'm going to run through some of the differences between houses in the UK and houses in Australia. I grew up in the UK, but I've also house sat in around 100 homes in Sydney over the last few years.
She just became so low quality? What the heck happened?
And I've noticed quite a lot of differences between homes in each country. There will be...
Hold on. Okay, I fixed it. No, I didn't.
I grew up in the UK, but I've also house sat in around 100 homes in Sydney over the last few years.
House sat? Is that what she said? Is that a real job? How do I become a house sitter?
And I've noticed quite a lot of differences between homes in each country.
Unless I have to fold laundry. I don't want to do that.
There will be variations across Australia because the climate varies so much. But these are the things I've noticed in Sydney homes. I've also written a blog post on this,
Sydney
which I'll link below. If you're interested in moving to Australia from the UK or vice versa, here's what to expect in your new home.
Okay, here we go.
So the first difference between houses in Australia and the UK is that in the UK you tend to have a whole row of houses along a road that have the same design repeated over and over, whereas in Australia you can have every house on a road being completely different.
That's definitely more so American, unless we're talking about like I was gonna say a subdivision, but even then, usually they're different. Sometimes you'll see like a few houses on a street that were obviously built by the same constructors, but yeah.
And I think this is due to people buying land in Australia and then having a home built on it, rather than people buying existing homes like they do in the UK. Some of the older housing in Australia is repetitive, like the old terraces and Federation homes that you have in Sydney, but generally you've got a really wide variation.
I've never seen anything like this in America.
Of housing styles along the same street.
Not quite like it, at least.
Another difference is that houses in Australia usually have a veranda across the front of the house, and this creates shade across the front window, and it's also quite a nice feature because people put chairs and benches on them that face out into the street. In the UK it's more common.
You know, I just never think about some things like shade across the front window. It's so interesting hearing people who think about this stuff a lot more.
To have a front porch if you've got space. So this is just a small glass room on the front of your front door, basically.
I guess in Australia, having shade, like shading the windows, actually probably is kind of important as far as insulation, maybe? Like it probably gets really hot. Just having the sun hit the windows and that coming in.
Where you store shoes and umbrellas and things, but they do get quite hot if they're in the sun, so it wouldn't really work in Australia. If you look up at the roofs on Australian houses, you'll see that the eaves overhang the house much more than in the UK, and this creates shade against the windows. In the UK, the eaves are really small and you get as much light as possible against the windows and as much warmth from the sun.
Amazing.
The windows...
Such an interesting small little detail I never would have thought of. You need to shade the windows in Australia.
Themselves are different between Australian and British homes. So in Australia, in the older homes, you'll often have wooden framed sash windows. And in the newer homes, you'll have big metal frames around your windows and they'll slide open sideways rather than opening outwards.
I will say overall though, American houses look more so like the Australian ones are reminding me more of America.
In the UK, you have nearly always double glazing, which you don't seem to have in Australia. And you normally have the thick plastic frames and windows that open outwards. You also have a layer of mesh, which is called a screen, over Australian windows, so that when you open them, flies and insects can't come in.
Yeah. They don't have that in the UK?
In Australia, it's really common to have a screen door, which means that when you open your front or back door, you have a second door next to it, which is usually made of mesh, and that just means you can keep the door open, have the breeze coming through, but no insects can come in as long as you keep the screen door closed.
They don't have that in the UK either? What the heck? We figured it out, huh? Yeah, you don't want the insects coming in. A lot of people have storm doors, though, here in America, where it's just a big piece of glass. You open up the main door. Yeah, that's what this looks like over here on the left.
In Australia, it's really common to have a separate laundry room or utility room.
Now, what even is that thing? What is that thing? It looks like some kind of robotic mouse sitting on the sink. Is that an iron? I've heard of these.
For your washing machine. In the UK, unless you've got a large house, you normally have to have your washing machine in the kitchen. I don't think I've ever seen that in Australia. Sometimes in older flats, they might have a communal laundry, but most of the apartments I've been in have had a separate laundry room inside the apartment.
So most of this is actually me just realizing that Australia is a lot more like America than the UK.
Australia, it's really common to have open plan houses, so the living room, dining room and kitchen are all basically one open room, whereas in the UK, your kitchen is nearly always separate, and then your living room and dining room sometimes are knocked through, but it's normally separate rooms.
We're connected. America,
in Australia,
we're on the same page.
It's much more common to live in a bungalow or a one-storey house than two-storey houses, whereas in the UK, bungalows are quite scarce and usually something that older people go for because they don't have stairs.
That just means it's a one-story house? Okay, we got that. That's what I'm in right now. I guess I live in a bungalow. Didn't know that.
If you have a two-storey house in Australia, you can get really, really hot up on the second floor if you don't have aircon. In the UK, you have a letterbox.
Because heat rises, guys. I'm pretty smart for an American.
Box on your front door, so basically a little hole in your front door, whereas in Australia you have a standalone letterbox that's out.
What? Why does it look like that? Some people actually do have this in their door in America, but what kind of a mailbox is that, guys? Why is one sticking out? What's the point of this triangle?
Facing onto the street.
I don't get it.
One of the biggest complaints that I hear from expats in Australia is how cold the houses get in Australia in the winter. So since Australian houses are built to stay cool, they're very often much colder inside than a British house would be in the same temperature. So generally in the daytime, it's colder inside the house in Australia than outside, whereas in the UK, it's the opposite. It's nearly always warm.
I never thought I would hear people complaining it's cold in Australia.
Inside your house than outside.
Okay.
One house I stayed in, it had a plug-in heater that had the temperature on, and when I woke up in the mornings, it was usually about 9 degrees inside. So having central heating throughout your house is really rare in Australia, and if people do have it, it's usually...
That makes sense, because you guys got the sun.
Through air vents rather than the radiators on the wall like we have in the UK.
But once again, America doesn't have radiators usually, so... We're more similar to Australia.
Houses have in Australia is a standalone gas heater that's attached to a gas pipe either coming out of the floor or the wall. You can also buy small...
See, now I've never seen that though, I will say. I don't know what this is over here in Australia. That's a heater?
Oil heaters in Australia that you plug in if you just want to heat at one room. Having a fire on the wall in the living room isn't very common in Australia. I have seen it in a few houses, but very few compared to the UK.
What?
Some of the older houses in Australia quite often have chimney breasts and really nice original fireplaces, but they're not really used as much as they are in the UK.
I never thought about that because you guys don't need a fireplace. Like they're not as practical, huh? But they look nice. I've never seen one in a wall like that, but you guys, she said older Australian houses are more likely to have them.
Obviously aircon is more common in Australia than in the UK, but not as many houses have it in Sydney as I expected actually.
Interesting.
So
okay, I thought you were all down with the air conditioning. How the hell do you survive in Australia without air conditioning? I just don't get it.
At the back of the houses, in Australia it's also common to have a veranda on the back of the house as well as the front. Or if you don't have a veranda, there's usually some kind of solid covering that shades the patio. Whereas in the UK, you would rarely have a covering over your patio. You'd try and get as much light and heat as possible. Conservatories also don't seem to exist in Australia, so this is basically an extension on the back of your house that's usually made of glass. And these are really common in the UK, but I don't think that would be possible in Australia with the heat.
It would like cook you. It would turn you into a human baked bean. Indeed.
Having a swimming pool in your back garden is obviously much...
I don't know why this is kind of funny to me. It's like it looks like a meme to me, like swimming pools in Australia. swimming pools in the UK. That's pitiful. I'm sorry. You can't even put something in the side walls to keep them up? I do like the slide though. Anyway, this is beautiful. Whoever lives there, if one of you guys lives here with this freaking, what is this, hot tub with a waterfall into the pool? Oh my God.
Much more common in Australia than it is in the UK. It's not as common as I thought it would be actually, although I would think going further north where it's hotter, it's probably more common to have a swimming pool.
That would make sense.
The bathrooms in Australia are quite different to in the UK. So in the UK, you can't have plug sockets in your bathroom normally. And in Australia, you always have plug sockets. This is apparently due to some difference with the electrical systems in Australian houses. That means it's safe to have sockets in.
But I assume you guys have GFC outlets like we do here in America. It looks like a normal outlet, but it has buttons on it to reset. Like it'll trip that outlet alone. It won't trip the main breaker. Anyway, what is this I'm looking at? This switch here, is this common? Fan, heat, light. I've never seen anything like that. And I do not know what the heat one means. How does that work? What's it heating? Is it just heating the bathroom? That would actually be awesome. I've also never seen words printed on a switch, and I've never seen switches like this. Everything about that is kind of strange to me. But it does seem practical, because that way you would know what they do if you go over to somebody's house. Over here in the UK, they just have a string.
Bathrooms where it can get wet. Also, the light switches are different in Australia. So in the UK, in your bathroom, you always have a pull cord so that you don't have to touch a switch if you're wet. And in Australia, it's just a normal light switch. And they also nearly always have fans in the bathroom. So you'll have a switch with a light on, the fan on, and occasionally also a heat switch where you have heated light bulbs.
Why? What do the heated light bulbs do? What does that mean? I've never heard of that. What's a heated light bulb? Does that heat the room?
This is a strange little difference, but in Australia, the side of bathtubs are nearly always solid, so they're quite often tiled, whereas in the UK, you tend to have a plastic panel. And I remember an Australian friend saying that she went to Wales and found this really strange because she'd never seen that before.
I don't even... Which part's plastic?
Australian friend saying they're quite often tiled, whereas in the UK, you tend to have a plastic panel.
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. I think both of these look normal. It's just this one looks fancier here over on the left.
I remember an Australian friend saying that she went to Wales and found this really strange because she'd never seen that before. Also, sinks in Australia, you nearly always have a cupboard underneath a sink in the bathroom, which we call a vanity. In the UK, it's more common just to have a sink on a stand. In Australia, they also have a few differences with household terminology. So what we'd call a sofa or a settee in the UK, Australians would call a lounge. And what we'd call a lounge or a living room in the UK, Australians would call the lounge.
You call the sofa itself a lounge. That's very, I don't know, that's very fancy. I wouldn't have thought that out. I would have thought you guys called it a Sophie. Let's go sit on the lounge.
Lounge room. Also, bedding and towels. In Australia, they call this Manchester, which is meant to be from the olden days when cotton items had to be imported from Manchester in the UK.
They had to be? Manchester. Once again, that's very fancy and long for an Australian word. I would have thought it was, surely you guys have shortened this. Many? Manor? Get the manna.
Also, a duvet is called a doona in Australia. They do use the word quilt as well, though. A flat or apartment in Australia is called a unit. So in Australia, you...
Same here in America. That's like the official term, If they're actually if they're like, yep, they're in unit 3. Yep. Like go fix their water heater in unit 3. Yeah.
You can sit on a lounge in the lounge room and then go and get under your Manchester and your doona. Thanks for watching. Let me know.
That was fun. I don't know. That was interesting. I felt kind of like a third wheel here. I guess I kind of felt like I was adding to it because we saw the UK, we saw Australian, and I'm over here saying, okay, and here's America. So that was fun. I learned certainly that for some reason, Australia is way more similar to America than the UK is in terms of housing structures and architecture, I guess you would call it. Anyway, Dreaming of Down Under, great video. That was cool. I hope you guys are doing well. How do I end a video? I forget. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Okay. It's getting awkward. Okay. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.